Hello again. Today we're going to deal with another topic that isn't really part of a series. I did a few talks a while back on strategy in the Punic Wars, and particularly the Second Punic War, and there we talked a little bit about the Roman army of the time, the Roman military system, and the Carthaginian armies and military system of the time. So there'll be a little bit of familiar ground with some of the things we're talking about today. And elsewhere I've talked about the development of the Roman legion, and I will certainly do far more talks on the Roman army in different periods over the months and years to come. But I thought today that we'd actually have a look at Hannibal's army in particular, but more generally place it within the context of the Carthaginian military system, how Carthaginian armies were formed, how they operated, how they worked tactically, the balance of the different contingents within them. Because the stereotype of Carthaginian armies is very much of a multinational force. This was an army that's often described as mercenaries, or foreigners fighting for pay, and you had troops from the Iberian Peninsula, you had troops from different regions and different ethnic groups within North Africa. You'd add in Gauls, you'd add in Ligurians from the northwest of the Italian Peninsula, the area near the Alps there. You'd add in, during Hannibal's campaigns, many Italians, and there are talk of other groups. There are Greek mercenaries that crop up at different times. We only really hear about the Carthaginian army in our surviving sources when they come into contact and usually conflict with the Greeks or the Romans. So you get some details of the earlier conflicts, particularly in Sicily in the 5th century BC and later, and then more particularly the detailed accounts come for the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Punic Wars. Though again we have far more information about Hannibal's army and his campaigns than the operations of any other Carthaginian leader and Carthaginian army. And even there we have big gaps in the sources. It's one of those great regrets that large parts of Polybius's account are missing, because he was writing closest in time to any of the surviving accounts and generally gives the impression of being more sober, more reliable, of having tried to get to the truth. We know that he and other ancient authors had access to sources written in Greek, but written by at least 2 people who accompanied Hannibal on some of his campaigns. There were presumably other accounts in the Carthaginian, in the Punic language as well, none of which have survived, but may have been translated when the Romans destroyed Carthage in 146 and took a lot of their literature with them. And before then, people like Cato the Elder would be trying, others would translate Carthaginian manuals to talk about agriculture, things like that, that the Carthaginians had a sophisticated knowledge, long-term experience of doing and organizing on a very grand scale, and the Romans copied lots of things. The Romans boasted about their willingness to copy military innovations, tactics, weaponry from others, from their enemies. They had no shyness about this, no sense of this being anything other than a very sensible thing to do. There are fewer cases where they talk about direct lessons they learned from the Carthaginians, but it's also very clear, as we've talked about in the series on strategy in the Second Punic War, that the Roman army learns the hard way through facing Hannibal, and that the leaders who appear by the latter stages of the war, most conspicuously Scipio Africanus, a survivor of Cannae, but also the men who overwhelm Hannibal's brother in the Metaurus campaign, and men like Flamininus, who go off and win the Second Macedonian War. They have all learnt their trade as soldiers, as military men, in the school of very hard knocks fighting against Hannibal, and in that arduous struggle that was the Second Punic War. So we have a stereotype of the Roman army as homogeneous, very organized, very efficient, very united, very purposeful, determined, tactically sophisticated, at least at a lower level, if not necessarily as fancy at the higher levels of command. And that then raises the basic question. During the course of the Second Punic War, most particularly in its early years, but for a long time afterwards, Hannibal inflicted defeat after humiliating and catastrophic defeat on Roman armies. On the Romans, who are supposedly the bee's knees when it comes to ancient armies, best equipment, best organization, uniform, all with a sense of purpose, not this mishmash of all sorts of different nationalities, some of them fighting for money, some of them fighting through alliance. don't speak the same language, brought together under the command of a man like Hannibal. The Romans outnumber him on more than one occasion, particularly at Cannae, and yet they lose. And they lose in a way that, on a scale that was rarely repeated even in the most brutal episodes of ancient warfare. Roman casualties are truly appalling. Again, something we can go back to if you look at the talks on strategy. So Hannibal inflicts these big defeats over the Romans. Now, one of the reasons why everything is a lot less simple than the stereotype suggests is that the Roman army of the later 3rd century BC was not yet the Roman army of our mind, the one we imagine, the army of Julius Caesar, the army of Augustus, and later, the professional force, the very sophisticated, experienced men, well-led, well-trained, well-equipped. It had aspects of that, and it would develop into that, but it wouldn't do that for quite a long time. So this was a rather different military entity, a much less permanent, certainly not professional military force in any way, though one that could gain experience and could learn from experience. So Hannibal doesn't beat the Roman army at its most sophisticated, but nevertheless he is still dealing with the Romans, who are a very dangerous opponent, who tend to win most of the wars in which they engage, win most of the battles they fight, and yet it takes them a very long time to bring down Hannibal. And of course this follows on from the First Punic War. Both the First and Second Wars last the best part of 2 decades, slightly more in the case of the first one, slightly less in the case of the second, and involve huge loss of life on both sides, but particularly for the Romans and their Italian allies in both conflicts, and most especially in the Second Punic War when Hannibal invades Italy. But there are defeats of Roman armies elsewhere. Scipio Africanus' father and uncle both die and perish with a large part of their army in campaigns in Spain against Carthaginian opponents. So things go very badly for the Romans, and it does mean you've got to explain this difference, because when the Romans confront the sophisticated military forces of the Hellenistic kingdoms, Macedonia, the Seleucids, they don't lose battles. They win all the major encounters. Now, some of them are pretty hard-fought fights, but nevertheless the Romans win, and the wars are resolved far, far more quickly. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for that have to do with manpower, organisation and structure of those kingdoms as well as the Romans, though, as we've talked about before and in the Conquered and the Proud series, it is perhaps particularly unfortunate from the point of view of the Macedonians and Seleucids that they take the Romans on in the aftermath of the Second Punic War, after which the Romans are extremely experienced militarily at all levels. Very good commanders, very well trained, disciplined and experienced and confident troops who've just, beaten a very dangerous enemy, and they know how to deal with anybody else. And they are far more experienced than most of the soldiers that Philip V of Macedonia or Antiochus the Great are able to put into their field armies, because they're not doing a lot of major field battles at that period. So the famed Roman legions, all their discipline, all their motivation, all their organisation, struggle to deal with Hannibal. So the basic question of this talk, when we're trying to understand Hannibal and the Carthaginian army, is how did this happen? What were the strengths and the weaknesses of this system? So just briefly, we'll talk about Carthage. There's more on the Carthaginian state in the other lectures on strategy, so we won't go into too much detail, though I dare say I will at some point in the future. Carthage was a republic, like the Roman Republic, but its organisation was very different, and it had a very small body of citizens. The male Carthaginian citizens, who could serve in the tradition of city-states of most states really throughout the Mediterranean world, formed a very small proportion of the overall population. And they were very jealous of citizen rights, hence the fact you get the group, the Libyan Phoenicians, people of mixed parentage, ancestry, of true Carthaginian, full Carthaginian citizens with the local Libyan population. And they have a status that is more privileged compared to the wider Libyan peasantry, but still not the same as a full Carthaginian citizen. Like a lot of Greek city-states, the Carthaginians do not hand out their citizenship in the way the Romans do, which most others would see as reckless, where you're giving it to freed slaves and you're freeing lots of slaves. You're giving it to allies, to former enemies, and you're turning them into Romans. they don't, this is the biggest difference perhaps between the Carthaginians and the Romans, is that the Carthaginian state is small in terms of the number of people who are full members of that state, who are full citizens, who have the political rights, who elect the leaders and have some say in how the state is conducted. Although they colonize, there are Carthaginian colonies to add to the other Phoenician colonies, like Carthage itself originally, that come within the Carthaginian Empire, within the Carthaginian sphere of influence, along the coast of Africa, in Sicily, earlier on in Spain, on some of the islands. These are all fairly small communities, and again the model is of a small number of citizens who essentially make all the decisions. Perhaps not too dissimilar from some Greek colonies as well. Elsewhere we tend to know less about Greek colonization than we might like, but it's a very different model. Whereas a Roman colony tends to have quite a substantial population, and you have colonies of full Roman citizens, you have Latin colonies, and the Roman citizens are considered to be fully part of the Roman state and citizen body, even if physically it might be difficult for them to get to Roman vote very often. Nevertheless, again, it's this difference between a state that's expanding its manpower on a scale not matched by any other ancient state, its citizen manpower. The Carthaginians do not do that. They remain closer to the normality, really, of ancient city-states. You have the group who are the true citizens, who are generally of one ethnic group. They're the descendants of the settlers. Presumably there's been intermarriage to keep the family lines going, but they are considered to be, they have the legal status of being fully Carthaginians, and they are an elite who have no intention of ceasing to be an elite within that society. So there is an elite within elite, because you obviously have the aristocracy, the very wealthy, who monopolize political office, monopolize positions on the ruling council, all this sort of thing. But nevertheless, there are other Carthaginian citizens who have status that others simply cannot gain. At least it's exceptionally rare for anybody to become a full Carthaginian citizen. So that does mean, as a fairly basic difference, the Carthaginians do not have the manpower for large armies to fight big battles, not from their citizen population. They have to look elsewhere for the rank and file soldiery to bulk out the armies. Now, one of the main sources throughout Carthaginian history, as far as we can tell, are the Libyan agrarian communities, the villages, the workers on the estates owned by the Carthaginians who produce the agricultural surplus, particularly of olives, of grapes, of tree crops, but more generally wheat and others as well, in well-irrigated systems that allow the trade of the Carthaginian Empire to flourish so much. You have this bulk crop that you can sell and allows you to trade in other things. You're always producing a big agricultural surplus. The Libyan peasantry, who do most of the labour to make this happen, also are conscripted, serve in the army, and prove to be exceptionally good soldiers. They seem to be organised, tough. When well trained and disciplined, they're very, very good. And even if, from the perspective of a modern observer, as far as we can tell with the evidence, they don't seem to get treated terribly well, nevertheless they prove remarkably loyal, most of the time anyway, to the Carthaginian overlords. So you have probably other similar agrarian worker force populations elsewhere around some of the colonies may also be recruited, but citizens figure in only a very small way. You do see them on certain occasions of crisis. You see them a little bit more in the earlier conflicts with the Greek tyrants of Syracuse and elsewhere, in the campaigns in Sicily, famously in 480 BC, when you have the big Carthaginian invasion of Sicily that matches or seems to coincide with the Persian invasion of Greece. It's another complicated issue we can come to another time, just how far the Greeks like to think of it that way and merge everything together, or the extent to which there might have been some coordination or at least opportunism. As I say, it's a little bit complicated. When the Roman army invades North Africa in the First Punic War under the consul Regulus, leads an army and defeats a Carthaginian army in battle before he's defeated in a second encounter, Carthaginians figure in both of these as a phalanx of citizen hoplite soldiers, essentially. in the model that's produced the armies of Greek states for a long time until they went more down the lines of mercenaries and professionals, and in the manner that the Roman army is still produced. By the time of the conflict with Rome, there is very little impression of large numbers of citizen Carthaginians serving outside North Africa itself, and they only serve even there when there's a real crisis, when things are starting to get desperate and people think, oh yeah, actually we better do something to defend our homes. They don't seem to serve as large units elsewhere, whether in Spain or in the march to Italy or wherever it might be. There may have been some small units of cavalry, that sort of thing. There may be quite a few who are serving as officers, as specialists, technical experts, siege engineers, whatever it might be, but there aren't large groups of them, large units that are notable enough, important enough, significant enough in numbers to get noted in our descriptions of the battles. They simply don't appear when you get the breakdown of armies fighting on any occasion or manoeuvring. So they're probably the officers, they're probably the experts, they're there, but they're not a significant part, a major part of the fighting power of the army in terms of actual units, rank and file and numbers. Naval power is a little bit more complicated. This has been a big deal, obviously, in the First Punic War, which is decided at sea. I mean, it is fought overwhelmingly in and around Sicily. The Romans do invade North Africa under Regulus, but when that turns sour and he's defeated, they don't repeat this. So this is very much a war decided by naval battles or raiding, invasions, landings around the coast of Sicily, and sieges and conflict within Sicily itself. The Carthaginian fleet in those years was very large, and it will be substantial later on. It just doesn't ever play quite the same role, to a great extent because they lose the bases within Sicily. And ancient fleets are very short range because, for their size, quinqueremes, the fives, the standard warship of the day, a bigger version of the trireme that had helped the Greeks defeat the Persians back at Salamis in 480 BC, and of course had figured so heavily in the Peloponnesian War and elsewhere. Things have escalated beyond that, where a bigger warship is your standard line of battle ship. This carries a very large crew in proportion to its size. So the figures we get from Polybius and elsewhere suggest something like 280 rowers to about 20 deck crew and officers, perhaps with some men serving as marines, as soldiers fighting from the deck. So that's a lot of people crammed into a small space, and a quinquereme like a trireme doesn't have a lot of extra space to carry water, which you're going to need if you're doing the hard work of rowing, particularly at the combat speeds and for the length of time needed to ram and avoid being rammed, or to collide with someone and board them, to rake them. All of these things that are required in a battle takes a lot of energy out of you. You're going to dehydrate very quickly in that heat, because not only you're in the Mediterranean, but you've got all that humanity concentrated in a small place, and you get, from the Greek side, the talk of the people on the lowest tier of the three who are getting all the sweat and goodness knows what else coming down onto them from the men above. So these crews are huge, and when you think there are very large fleets described in the First Punic War, if you've got a crew of effectively 300 or so, that's even before you've added marines, 100 of those means 30,000 men. 300 of those, and we're talking 300 plus figures in battles like Ignomus, that's 90,000 men. That's, as I say, before any troops you're carrying, any marines you're added to the crew. So these are huge numbers, bigger than almost any field army, that are routinely used in the big naval clashes of the First Punic War, and even to some extent they're never quite as big, but there's still large numbers of people around in the Second Punic War and later on. And if you look at the harbour that's preserved, the circular military harbour or naval harbour in Carthage itself, you get a sense of the number of warships that were still available even in the 2nd century BC, when you tend to think of Carthage as a substantially reduced, far less powerful state. If you're going to operate these sorts of ships with these sorts of crews, those crews need to be trained if you're going to have any level of efficiency. It takes a fair bit of coordination to learn to row properly, and of course, like anything else, to build up the stamina to do it strongly enough and for long enough so that it matters. these crews need to be trained. It was the advantage that you would have with the Athenians earlier on in the Persian War and in the heyday of the Athenian Empire. The Carthaginians clearly have something similar. They can muster large numbers of ships. Now, the Romans managed to find a way around that, and as the war goes on, become as well trained as the Carthaginians, helped by the fact that the huge losses early on mean that many of your trained personnel are lost quite early on in the war, and then anyone replacing them is having to learn from scratch, which the Romans have been doing as well. So the two sides come together in terms of ability during the First Punic War. It's a little bit harder to say who these people are, who these tens of thousands, perhaps even 90 to 100,000 that you might need for these really big fleets. It could be, one suspects, that rather like in ancient Athens, you have a lot of your poorer citizens might end up doing this. Presumably quite a lot of your captains, your officers are again Carthaginian citizens. But the odds are you probably couldn't field that number of Carthaginian citizens simply because there weren't enough around there, and many of your wealthy, well-to-do citizens aren't going to want to go and row in a galley, which is not terribly comfortable, apart from being dangerous. So the poor perhaps, hired foreigners, a mixture of those, who knows? We do conscripted Libyans or others. We don't really know. We don't know the details. The numbers appear in our sources, but nobody actually explains who they are at any point. And even in the Second Punic War, as I say, there are a significant number of ships, and they become involved in the defense of Africa, of Spain, and some of the fighting around Sicily, although they don't for any length of time manage to recapture the ports there. Although Hannibal secures Tarentum after some years of manoeuvring around Italy, and he's urged to get a major port, he isn't able to keep it for all that long. And there are problems. If you haven't got bases to stop off in Sicily, then Italy is at the extreme range of any fleet operating from the North African coast. So it's risky. You've got to be very confident that you can land and have a secure base and not be vulnerable to Roman forces. See, because again, all these people piled onto these ships, you can't keep them there permanently without them starting to suffer. So anyway, Carthaginian naval forces are something of a mystery. We don't know anything like as much about them as even compared to the army, and there are plenty of questions we can't answer about the army. So let's look at the Carthaginian army, which from the start, as we've said, is overwhelmingly consisting of non-Carthaginians. There are substantial Libyan contingents that you could consider as part of the Carthaginian state. The Libyans do not have a political system independent of the Carthaginian Republic. So even though they don't have full citizen rights, they are not necessarily equivalent in terms of their rights and their conditions to, say, the Helots in Sparta and in some other the similar groups in Thessalian cities in Greece in the classical and archaic periods, where they are part of the state, but they are not full citizens. So they're not quite slaves, but they are also restricted by law. They have major obligations placed on them. They have relatively few rights, certainly substantially fewer than the full citizens, even though they are expected to go off and fight. Think back to classical Sparta, and the Helots are expected to go off with Spartan armies, even though they're not exactly treated very well in peacetime. Something like that's probably going on in Carthage. So the Libyans are slightly different, and they are part of the Carthaginian state, and yet they're not Carthaginian citizens. But let's have a look and a breakdown of some of the forces that are described in some detail. Now, it's a curious thing that Polybius, when he's talking about the early stages of the Second Punic War and Hannibal's preparations before he sets out on his epic march to Italy, tells us in some detail about the forces that Hannibal leaves behind in Spain and that he sends to North Africa to protect those regions from any Roman counterattack. He doesn't then go into a detailed breakdown of the army that Hannibal is taking to Italy with him, the one that's really going to do all the key and exciting stuff. And that's just a tad annoying, but then that's the nature of ancient sources. They so often, even when they survive, don't answer all the questions that interest us, that we'd like to know about, that would tell us so much. Now, Polybius notes that Hannibal took precautions for the security of Africa, adopting a very sensible and wise policy of sending soldiers from Africa to Spain, and vice versa, binding by this measure the two provinces to reciprocal loyalty. You often get this turned into a general rule for and applied to the Carthaginians and even sometimes to the Romans, that you take troops from one region and then send them elsewhere, so somewhere where they won't have much in common with the locals, so that they're not likely to rebel. They'll remain loyal because if you send a lot of Iberians off to North Africa, they don't have lots of other Iberians to talk to. They can't get together with the local Libyan peasantry and necessarily have any common cause. And similarly, if you've got Libyans or Numidians or whatever in Spain, they don't get on with the locals. They're as much foreigners and invaders as far as the locals are concerned, so there's less chance of them defecting. And it's perceived as a way of controlling non-citizen foreign troops that you use. And it's sometimes applied to the Roman army, the idea that auxiliary units are generally posted away from the places where they're raised. While that's true to some extent, over time the impression we get is that the Roman army recruits from the nearest source, so that quite a lot of units end up largely being fairly locally recruited. It's not necessarily in the area they're actually serving, but not so far away as all that. Although again, that's another thing when we'll come back to the auxiliaries, we no doubt will lots of times. It's a lot more complicated now. These sort of rules of thumb and these great sweeping statements, oh, this is what they're doing, when you look more closely prove to be a lot more complicated than that, and it's true here as well. So the troops that Hannibal sends to Africa in 218 BC consist of contingents from 4 different Iberian peoples, and they're named as the Thersitai, the Massitani, the Orestes, and the Olcades. And in total, there's 1,200 cavalry, 13,850 infantry, so quite precise numbers. When you're getting down, not even just rounding up to hundreds, you're mentioning 50. There are also 870 Balearic slingers that go with them from the Balearic Islands. Now, these are famous as slingers and for their ferocity. You get these stories told about them that children were only able to eat when they were growing up the animals that they'd shot with their slings that they learned to use from, almost as soon as they could walk, so that they could shoot rabbits or whatever and eat that way. Well, possibly not rabbits there in this period, but anyway, let's not worry too much about that. So those are sent to Africa from Spain, and in addition, 4,000 Libyan foot were drawn from their communities and stationed in Carthage to serve both as reinforcement and hostages. So Polybius is very much emphasizing this idea that you take the young men from a community because you want them to fight for you, but they're also hostages for their community's good behavior. So in a sense that if the community decides to rebel or doesn't support you so much, you've got all these people that presumably you can then imprison, execute, whatever you might want to do. Does rather imply you've got somebody who is still loyal who's going to do that, and as you haven't got many citizen troops, who would that be? But nevertheless, this is certainly how a Greek, an outsider, someone who is more sympathetic to the Romans, is depicting the way that the Carthaginians are doing things. And he's depicting it as, isn't this clever? Not that this is a terrible thing and isn't this cruel, but this is how a sensible empire works. So, there's probably something to the idea, but we should not exaggerate too much. At the same time, to Spain, Hannibal sends 450 Liby-Phoenician and Libyan cavalry. So again, you have this distinction of these Liby-Phoenicians, these people of mixed race, of higher status than the Libyans, lower than the Carthaginian citizens. They do seem to serve as units of cavalry, though admittedly probably fairly small numbers. I mean, it's 450 in total, and some of the contingent are just Libyans. So even if it was half and half, you're not dealing with vast forces. They're numbering in hundreds rather than thousands, but significant enough to be an effective military unit on the battlefield. There are 300 cavalry recruited from the Elergites, 1,800 Numidian cavalry drawn from, again, 4 different groups of Numidians, Massiliae, Mysalii, Makoi, and Morusi, 11,850 Libyan foot, 300 Ligurian foot. Now those are from the north of the Italian peninsula. So they've presumably been recruited at some stage. This is an area that's independent of Rome, these hilltop mountain tribes that are fiercely independent, but again, a relatively small unit. 300 have come presumably as mercenaries. They've been recruited in some way or other. They're being paid. They've been stationed, formed in North Africa near Carthage, and now they're sent to Spain to act as a field force, both to protect the Iberian Peninsula against any Roman offensive, should those happen, but also to keep Carthaginian power there protected from any rebellions, any attempts by the tribes, the people who live there, to change their minds about putting up with Carthaginian rule. Carthaginians have expanded by force to a great extent. The force and diplomacy, that combination that most empires employ. Bear in mind, Hannibal's father has died fighting against Iberian tribes. So they can't be absolutely secure that the base Hannibal's launched his invasion of Italy from will remain loyally Carthaginian unless there are troops there. So this is a force in the same way that the ones in North Africa are hostages for their home communities, according to them. These are people like the Iberians who've gone to North Africa. The troops that go to the Spanish Peninsula are there to protect it from any threat, whether it comes internally or whether it comes externally from the Romans. They also have 500 Balearic slingers, 21 elephants, and then a navy of 50 quinquiremes, 2 tetramarines, 5 triremes. However, there's only full crews for 32 of the quinquiremes and 5 of the triremes. So again, an interesting detail where you have the ships and you hope that if you need them, you've got enough time to recruit more rowers and train them and get them ready for battle. But in the meantime, you've only got, roughly 2/3, that sort of number, a proportion that you can use at any moment. Because these fleets, even a comparatively small one of 50 or so ships, are incredibly demanding in manpower. You need an awful lot of people, and you don't always have that number available. So you're relying on, but it's quicker to get people and train crews than it is to build ships. So you've got the basis of an expanded small fleet, large squadron, call it flotilla, call it what you will. So you've got, those are the forces that are described. As I say, we have that nice detailed breakdown, which then Polybius does not extend to Hannibal's army. He is much vaguer about its composition. They're making it clear that many of the ethnic groups that we've seen mentioned are included within Hannibal's army, but he's not specific about the numbers. So you have, for instance, Numidians we'll see, Libyan infantry we will see. We tend to assume, and there are some hints at Libyan, perhaps Libyo-Phoenician cavalry. Spanish, Iberians, Lusitanians, some Celtiberians perhaps as well. Peoples from the Spanish Peninsula. One thing to emphasize when we talk about a group like the Numidians, we talk about the Iberians, Lusitanians, Ligurians even, or Gauls later on, these are not nations. These are not united groups that have that any sense at all really of political unity. So it was emphasized in the different contingents to go that the Iberians are coming from 4 different distinct tribal groups, communities, call them what you will. The Numidians, very much the same. In a number of 1,800, they're from 4 different political entities, social groups. So you've got, again, you're assuming that means units of what, if you just averaged out 450 each, coming from each of these 4. Now, obviously, it might not be as neat as that. So they're providing sort of regiments rather than whole brigades, divisions, all from one particular group. So there would be a lot of rivalries, a lot of sense of perhaps old enmities and hostilities between these groups. They are not united under a single leader. So they're not, just because they're all Numidians doesn't necessarily mean they'll all want to do the same thing and they'll all act the same way, although their fighting style does seem to be very similar. We'll come back to that in due course. So Hannibal has these, and later on we'll see that he adds Gauls and various southern Italians, particularly after Cannae. And again, emphasize that just like everybody else, just like the Iberians, the Numidians, they're not all the same. These are tribes, small nations, city-states, and there are even disputes within these kingdoms for power. So a particular group of Numidians might not always be on the same side. There will be faction fighting that we see and that is exploited by the Romans later on. Scipio Africanus is able to persuade Massinissa and other Numidians to join him and join the Roman army and fight for him, a critical factor deciding the Zama campaign that ends the war because of personal rivalries within the royal families of these groups. So these are not united. These are ethnic groups who might work together but might not. Hannibal's army appear mainly to be, I'm tempted to use the word professional, though it has all sorts of baggage that doesn't really work. Long-term warriors or soldiers, like presumably those 300 Ligurians that crop up in North Africa and get sent to Spain. You know, they've decided they're doing this as something that is a profitable way. It's a way perhaps for young men with not much left for them at home. They don't have land, they don't have flocks, they don't have property, to go off, earn a living with their sword, with their spear, perhaps to go back home eventually with reputation, with money, or simply because it's, you know, that's more comfortable, or it's dangerous back home, you've lost out in a civil war. All the reasons that have inspired large numbers of people throughout the ancient world to go off and take mercenary service under all sorts of leaders and for all sorts of states, whether it's Greeks fighting for the Persians, or it's the Greek mercenaries that become so common in the 4th century BC everywhere. Again, I think we talked about it in The Conquered and the Proud. There's an interesting thought that to some extent simply recruiting a lot of your younger, more aggressive men from tribal groups, from potentially hostile groups, and sending them off to fight on your behalf and paying them and rewarding them is a good way of stopping them fighting you, because it's a sort of safety valve basically. And the Carthaginians may well have, partly one of the reasons for their success in Spain is that they're doing that. They're taking away a lot of this population that struggles otherwise to make a living and is inclined to turn to raiding, to living by the sword, living by the spear. Again, we've talked about this a little bit back in The Conquered and the Proud, and we spoke about imperialism and the context of it, particularly in the Western Mediterranean. So let's look at Hannibal's army and its numbers before we talk more about the type. Polybius again and Livy give us some breakdown of the army, and it's a really huge one that sets out from New Carthage in the spring of 218 BC. The figures given are 12,000 cavalry, 90,000 infantry, so over 100,000 men, and that's your fighting men. You're not talking about the servants, the camp followers and others, along with 37 elephants. You get detachments and losses. Some of them are just seem to vanish. So by the summer of 218, 1,000 cavalry and 10,000 infantry, according to Polybius, and Livy talks about at least 11,000 other less reliable troops left behind in eastern Spain or sent back to their home communities. So at this stage you seem to have included with the army men who are supplied by allied communities as part of their treaty obligation to Carthaginians. So they go off for campaigning season to help Hannibal as he fights his way to the Pyrenees, but then are allowed to go home. So they are serving a useful purpose. They fight for you. They're also perhaps the hostage element that Polybius talks about with the Libyans in North Africa. They're useful, but they're not mouths you want to feed. They're probably not your best troops in terms of a long-term campaign, because that's not what they're doing. They're happy to go out and fight for a season as they would for their own tribe, because effectively that's what they're doing, and they're probably doing it largely under their own leaders, but they are not people who are committed to a full-out war effort under Hannibal fighting against Rome or whoever he chooses to fight. After crossing the Pyrenees, the army has shrunk to 9,000 cavalry and 50,000 infantry, according to Polybius. So the infantry have lost 40,000, not quite half in that time, but a substantial proportion of those have deliberately been sent home. Others may simply have proved to be unfit for a long march of this duration, and you haven't got to the really hard bit yet. One thing to note that's significant: 10,000 cavalry when you start, 9,000 at this point. So you've probably sent many of those 1,000 away, and you're keeping. The cavalry are important. The cavalry are an elite. They will be. one of the components of his force that Hannibal will use with great success. So they do rather better. They don't suffer proportional losses compared to the infantry, which, as I think I've mentioned before in one of the talks on strategy, in most circumstances you expect a horse to break down before a man will break down on a long march in difficult conditions. And ultimately, if things get really desperate, a man can eat a horse can't eat a man. So you'd expect the cavalry to suffer a higher rate of attrition, so it's significant when they don't. After they've crossed the River Rhone, so still the summer of 218 BC, and they've engaged in fighting, the Gallic tribes of southern Gaul, that area, have quite understandably decided they didn't want some foreign army marching through their territory, have fought Hannibal. Hasn't gone terribly well for them, but it will have cost lives in the process. Polybius then says Hannibal has got 8,000 cavalry and 38,000 infantry. So again, very significant drops in numbers. Now that might be through men, there's no specific mention of more men being sent home, but perhaps that's happened. It might be through people deciding, well, blow this for a game of soldiers, I'm going home, and deserting, and they're not worth chasing. But again, note, although the cavalry have suffered a significant loss, that's still far smaller in proportion than the loss suffered by the infantry. Your best troops are keeping on going. And finally, in the late autumn of 218 BC, when he's crossed the Alps and he's arrived in northern Italy, Hannibal has 6,000 cavalry, apparently predominantly a mixture of Numidian and Spanish, though as I say there might be a few Libyans or Libyo-Phoenicians around as well that don't get mentioned, 20,000 infantry that are specified as 12,000 Libyan and 8,000 Spanish. Now we know he also has Balearic slingers because they appear at various points in the next few years. Either they're being lumped in with the Spanish, though that hasn't been the case in many of the other counts, or they're not mentioned here. But again, you've gone from nearly 100,000 men to 26,000. So you've basically, almost 25% of your army that started out has actually arrived in Italy. Now, some of that is deliberate. Some of these are people who've been sent behind. We can break down the numbers a little bit. Polybius tells us that the numbers he gives for the arrivals in Italy are based around an inscription set up by Hannibal before he left Italy, near the end of the war. So these are numbers supplied by Hannibal himself. On the other hand, he doesn't appear to have derived all the other sources for the original size of the expedition and the losses from this same source, which makes things a little bit difficult. So, if they're correct, Hannibal's detaching something like 22,000 men before leaving Spain, and then loses about 4,000 cavalry and 50,000 infantry through combat, disease, desertion, attrition in the 5 months it takes him to get from New Carthage to Italy. So you can break it down as part of the journey. New Carthage to the Pyrenees, 21,000. Pyrenees to the Rhone, 13,000. The Rhone to Italy, 20,000. So those are big numbers. And Polybius does comment elsewhere that Hannibal had lost nearly half of his army in the last phase of the march, mostly in crossing the Alps, and that the losses amongst baggage animals had been even higher, which again is what you'd expect because the animals are going to break down, and of course going through the passes of the Alps, facing those ambushes, there are times when they're suffering badly. But again, the cavalry have suffered something like 50% overall loss compared to 88% of the infantry. So far more cavalrymen, far more of the pick of your army with their mounts get to Italy. It is mentioned in our sources that those horses are not in the best of states, but nevertheless they are still effective. And I may have quoted this before, but it's like you can get Napoleon's cavalry in the Eylau campaign, where it's described that they can't charge it faster than a trot, but they are still able to charge, even if just not very fast. And often, for a disciplined force, a slower, more determined trot where you're not going to back down can be more devastating and is more likely to put your opponents to flight than the wilder charge that beloved of Hollywood and so spectacular, and that enthusiastic but less experienced horsemen will tend to do. It's I suppose the classic contrast between the Cavalier, the Royalist cavalry in the English Civil War in the early stages under the dashing Prince Rupert and Cromwell's Ironsides, and then the cavalry of the Eastern Association, and then the New Model Army, that emphasis on, as Cromwell said, charging at a pretty round trot. So, but anyway, they've got there. The horses need some time to recover, and no doubt they will get remounts as well from when they can acquire them. But it's very much a mark of the elite has got there. Your best troops have got there. So also have, as far as we can tell, all your elephants. You started with 37. He seems to have about that number when he arrives. Within barely 12 months, all but one will die. So again, their health might not be that great, but they've got there. So the bits that you value particularly highly have got there, and probably the infantry contingents that have got there are your very best men. So the troops that arrive are overwhelmingly these professional, full-time, experienced, highly motivated, well-trained, extremely determined soldiers. I mean, you've got to be pretty determined to keep going after all of that and not to give in. And presumably a lot of that attrition are people who just won't march any further, or who slope off because they can't take it, or don't feel committed to Hannibal or the cause. At their lower levels, many of these groups are commanded by people of their own ethnicity, their own leaders. You know, we see this more clearly with some of the Numidian contingents, and people like Massinissa, who will serve under Hannibal in Italy before they defect later in the war, change sides, or as they would see it, do what's in the best interest of themselves and their people, because they are not subjects of Carthage, they are allies of Carthage, and they decide to become allies of Rome. The army will then be supplemented by recruits that are less experienced, less trained, perhaps less motivated than these tough professionals, semi-professionals, committed warriors, committed soldiers that have gone and followed Hannibal all the way and got to Italy. So once he's in Italy, he starts trying to recruit very, very quickly. More come in after his victory in the large-scale sort of cavalry action, small battle, big skirmish, call it what you will, at the River Ticinus. More will come after he wins the victory at Trebia, but he's already got a significant contingent of Gauls in that battle. And these are from the local tribes, who obviously have plenty of reasons to dislike the Romans, because the Romans are encroaching on their territory, they're colonizing the area, they're taking their land. The Romans are a direct threat to the people there, so if somebody big and strong is coming to fight the Romans, it's reasonable enough to join him to fight. However, many tribes do not, and many wage their war their own way because that's what they've always done. They don't feel they need anybody. So it's easy to forget that after Cannae there's a smaller scale disaster, but a couple of Roman legions are wiped out under Postumus in the Alps, campaigning against these tribes of Cisalpine Gaul. So they continue to fight on their own behalf, loosely in the same cause. At least they're fighting against the Romans, but they're not necessarily in any way coordinated with Hannibal's efforts. You also get the armies that, apart from these sort of semi-professionals, you supplement the army with allies that may be short-term or long-term. So Hannibal takes these Gallic allies, he'll take some more Ligurians, he will start, particularly after Cannae, to recruit Italian allies from Samnites, from other groups who decide that they'd rather be with Hannibal than with Rome. These again as allies supply contingents that will mostly come under their own leaders, serve in their own units, fight in their own style. There's a process of integrating these into the command structure, the way the army works, and you can see changes whereby the Gauls are very much fighting in their own group as a separate part of the line at Trebia, probably at Trasimene. By Cannae, units of Gauls are interspersed with units of Iberians and other people from the Spanish Peninsula, as we'll see when we come on to tactics and fighting style, so that they're basically alternating along the line, which implies that you've become more part of the main army under Carthaginian control, and you're no longer so bothered about only having fellow tribesmen, fellow clansmen next to you or near to you. You can actually go units you are willing to trust Iberians and people from a very different areas speaking a different language to fight alongside you. By the time of Hannibal's attack on Tarentum, where, as with most successful stormings of cities at this time, treachery admits his men into the city, he specifically chooses several contingents of Gauls to move fast and rush in and to seize key points within the position. And they're very much, by this time, at least these units are no longer allies entirely under their own commanders doing their own thing just alongside you. They are very much part of the Carthaginian army. They seem to have become indistinguishable in the way they work, not necessarily the way they fight, from the Iberians, the Libyans and others that you can command to do things and you can trust to perform a very specific and important specialized role. Now, Carthaginian armies elsewhere will tend to have a higher proportion of these temporary allies that fight in contingents of their own, under their own leaders, supplied by the communities of the Iberian Peninsula, often under their own kings, their own leaders, similarly with the Numidians, that bulk out your numbers, can be very formidable, very effective fighters, but they're not so closely integrated into the way your army works. They are probably less easy to maneuver for you, less easy to command. They're not sort of being bolted into the system as these different contingents are with Hannibal's army. And they almost always have their own leaders. And you find even there is a classic case where Scipio Africanus launches a surprise night attack on the Carthaginian army and a nearby Numidian army in Africa after he's invaded there later on in the war. The two contingents are camping separately and they are destroyed separately. So it again suggests you're cooperating, but you're cooperating very much as allies, and you have to treat with dignity, with tact, with some degree of sort of negotiation your allied contingents to get them to work with you. You have similar things in Spain where the contingents provided by the tribes are far less maneuverable. Again, the victory at Ailipid relies to a great extent on the Romans changing their deployment after days and days of deploying in the same way, and the Carthaginians are expecting that, and the Carthaginians can't react and can't adapt at the last minute. Now, partly that's a question of time, but it's made far more difficult because a big chunk of your army are allies that won't obey orders quite as neatly, simply and quickly as the men that you've brought under the command structure of these Carthaginian leaders. Again, come back to that in a minute. In the Sacred War, the mercenary war that occurs after the First Punic War, when, rather foolishly, the Carthaginian government is trying to pay the Romans the indemnity they've demanded and decides, like all governments that it needs to cut costs, and like so many governments more recently, doesn't think very sensibly about where these costs can be cut, just go with, well, who are the people we care about least, so they don't pay their mercenary army that's been fighting in Sicily for years under Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, and they don't feel they've been beaten. Suddenly they're not only not demobilized, but they're not given their back pay, and they rebel. They mutiny, they unsurprisingly complain, and then a very difficult war is fought, and Hamilcar has to defeat his own troops, or former troops, before this rebellion is defeated. But one of the big problems, one of the things that hinders the rebels' cause, is that they don't share a common language other than the Punic they've picked up in the camp, but also there are not existing leaders for high command positions within this army, because essentially all the senior ranks have been filled by Carthaginians and they don't rebel. So although you've got maybe unit leaders and sort of at the lower level, anyone who can coordinate, who can get maneuver tens of thousands or thousands even, rather than hundreds or dozens or smaller unit tactics, you don't have the experience. You're learning on the job, and this is it's a situation. Think of the 1857 mutiny in India, primarily of the Bengal army, the Indian mutiny, the Great Rebellion, call it what you will. One of the problems the mutineers have is that although they're very brave, skilled soldiers, the British have always provided the top level of command, so people are having to learn on the job, which is much, much harder. You don't have your existing brigade commanders, battalion commanders, regimental commanders, let alone above that. So it weakens what would otherwise be a very formidable army, because the basic soldiers are extremely good and they're well trained and they know what they're doing, but they haven't got anybody to tell them what to do, that they're used to obeying, and who knows how to do it or has some practice in this. So similar things that will be defeated, but again, we'll come back to command in a moment. Let's look at tactics and fighting styles. Now, obviously, you think about the Carthaginian army, and you don't just think of it being very heterogeneous in terms of its ethnic groups. You know, you've got all these different mercenaries, allies, professionals, whatever they are, Numidians, your Libyans, your Iberians, your Lusitanians, your Gauls, your Samnites. And we think of them as all fighting in a very different way. Now, this partly reflects the truth, but there is also a tendency towards stereotyping, both in ancient sources and then modern investigations backed by archaeology, because obviously we're most likely to find either sculptures depicting these troops in a specific way, or equipment, particularly the metal equipment, spearheads, javelin heads, swords, arrowheads, this sort of thing, sling bullets. And then we tend to build the soldier around his equipment. And we think, well, if you've got a Spanish-style sword, whether one of the curved ones or one of the straight ones, and you've got the heavy javelin, you know, this is equipment very much like a Roman, maybe that's how you fight. Or you get all sorts of, you know, rather wilder stereotypes. The one that, oh, well, yeah, people from Spain, they're always basically skirmishers, because it's just like the guerrillas in the Peninsular War against Napoleon, you know, the War of Independence for Spanish people. Oversimplistic, you know, sometimes yes, but not always. They do all sorts of other things as well. One of the big problems we have is that our imagery, what little of it there is, shows a Numidian looking like this. And Numidians in particular do seem to keep fighting in much the same way as light cavalry. They don't seem to like armour, they don't seem to like saddles. You know, they ride with a very basic bridle, without a bit and all this sort of thing. And they throw javelins from a distance. They're skirmishers who only swoop in when they've weakened the enemy to the point where they can overwhelm them. Then they're as ferocious as anybody. You know, a sort of shorter range version of a horse archer's way of fighting. They're skillful at what they do, they know what they're doing, and they fight in their own distinctive way. It's less easy to say with the Iberians, Gauls, the others, the infantry soldiers that serve for a long, long time in the army, whether they keep fighting in their traditional way or whether they become more and more alike. We know, for instance, that after his early successes in 218 and 217 BC, that Hannibal re-equips his Libyan soldiers, who up until now have had round sort of hoplite-style shields, hoplon type, similar to the Greek pattern, thrusting spears, presumably a sort of cuirass again, pretty much in many respects looked as we would consider later Greek hoplites to look, and presumably fight in some sort of relatively close ordered phalanx, though again you start talking about phalanxes and there's a whole range of debates about precisely how Greek phalanx tactics works and how hoplites operate and all this sort of thing, which we will deal with one day, that I'm writing about at the moment, but it'll be a while before that book's out and probably a while before I do any talks on it. He then re-equips them with Roman equipment stripped from the dead and the prisoners. Exactly what that consists of is harder to say. Does he replace the thrusting spear with the pilum? They start now using throwing spears rather than thrusting spears. The swords, yeah, presumably Roman-style swords, which they've been copying from the Spanish and buying from the Spanish-style sword. That's a good sword to have. Maybe armour, maybe mail armour, presumably the long oval scutum body shield. To some extent they may be taking all of this because their own gear's been pretty worn out in this heavy fighting. Shields in particular take an awful lot of punishment for those in the front ranks that are actually doing the fighting, because better that the shield take the punishment than the man behind it. We know of them, a lot of Hannibal's army receiving clothes and some equipment as well during the passage of the Alps from friendly tribes. They've already had some stuff that's supplied. They may stop looking so distinctively ethnically Libyan, Iberian, whatever, as time goes on. And by the very end of Hannibal's campaigns, and the Zama campaign in North Africa, the troops that he's brought back from Italy are described as his veterans, and they are presented as very much a homogeneous group of heavy infantry that, you know, fight together. Now, whether that's concealing that there are still significant differences in tactics between particular ethnic groups. Maybe, maybe not. We don't really know. There is simply not enough description. But it might well be that you become rather like the mercenary forces elsewhere. You move towards a sort of standard way of fighting that works and is based around the enemy you're having to oppose, the equipment that's available and that's best suited to dealing with that enemy, and the way you've got used to fighting. So things might not be quite so simple. Earlier on, things are probably far more distinct, and especially when you've brought in allied troops or recently recruited contingents that are serving for pay or for whatever reason, they're coming ready formed and ready trained with their own equipment and their own fighting style. Again, we have to be a little bit careful because the evidence so often, as I say, is based around the archaeological evidence for weaponry, and we do often build a soldier around his weapons and then think of a distinctive way of fighting, and sometimes the design of a particular spearhead might not drastically change the way the individual fights. That might be the way you prefer to make things, the way that's traditional. It isn't necessarily fundamentally or profoundly different in the way you actually fight in battle. Most of your contingents, there are some troops who fight in loose order as skirmishers, among them the Balearic slingers, but there are also clearly men skirmishing with javelins. They seem to come from several different ethnic groups, and they are quite organised and disciplined. Some of the allied ones that come along may be less so, but again, the longer they stay with the army, the more likely they are to learn how to do things, be taught how to do things. So you have, but again, how the command and control works with them, very hard to say, and whether you have whole units of skirmishers or whether a proportion of more lightly equipped, perhaps less wealthy, whatever it might be, men from other units, other contingents, go out in front of the main body and skirmish rather like the Roman velites or part of the legion, but they also fight differently, and they do seem to be associated with particular maniples, at least from the point of view of camping and organisation. Polybius does rather stress the difference in appearance and, by implication, some of the fighting style of the Iberians and the Gauls at Cannae in 216 BC, and he contrasts the clothing, the whitish tunics with the purple reddish border of the Iberians, the warriors who've come from Spain, and their shorter, better swords, better made rather than the long, wild slashing swords beloved of the Gauls that are sometimes blunt and you can't deliver a proper thrust with and all this sort of thing and need a bit more space, are open you out, because while you're cutting and slashing down your shoulder, your armpit, that area is more exposed to the enemy. It's one of those cliches you get throughout a lot of ancient literature. It's exaggerated, things are mild more complicated than that, but there's clearly, looking at them, there is a difference, and we'd add in the stereotype of the Gaul, taller, fairer, maybe their hair limed to be spiky or with rather ornate helmets, checkered tartan clothes and cloaks, brightly coloured, emphasis on display, on spectacle, on a sort of warrior showing off, essentially. And it's possible that they are selected to form Hannibal's centre, not simply because he's got quite a lot of them. They're numerically the largest infantry contingent at Cannae, but also that saying to these men, you are warriors, I'm going to place you at the point of most danger. You will be the first to meet the main enemy attack. Stand here, fight and face him, man to man, and show your courage, is an appeal to the mentality, the ideology of Gallic warriors, and would show Hannibal knowing how best to motivate, use, even exploit the different material with his army. So there's an interesting possibility that that's what he's doing at that early stage, when the Gauls have only been with him a year and a half in most cases. Coming on to 2 years for some, but only just, it's not quite 2 years really. And some may have joined later than that. So there could be an element of Hannibal playing up the ferocity of the Gauls, because bear in mind, with the tactics at Cannae, he wants his centre to give way, but not straight away. He's advanced it towards, so it's the middle of the line is bulging towards the Roman army, because he wants to suck this big sledgehammer blow by massed Roman infantry into the trap that will be formed by the Libyans that are his second line behind his main line, almost certainly invisible to the Romans, and are waiting to close on either side of them like a vice when the Romans finally do push back the centre and break through, as they do. So again, that could be Hannibal taking advantage of the fact that his army is different and has all these different contingents with different ways of fighting, different ideology. He's combining those to best possible effect. And that's something we'll return to, because that's clearly what he is doing. And this could be an aspect of that, the different style of fighting, different expectations of what a battle meant, what warfare meant for your Gauls with a heroic culture, is something that he can make use of to his own advantage. He also intersperses each contingent of Gauls with Iberians, who are far more experienced, who've been with him from the start and from beyond that. They're part of the army that's been formed under his family and campaigned with great success under his father, under his brother-in-law in the Iberian Peninsula for many years. Troops he knows are very dependable, very good, though there are fewer of them than there are the Gauls by now. They will fight alongside the Gauls, so they will provide a sort of stiffening to the enthusiastic but perhaps less disciplined, easier to tire Gallic contingent. So you can look at it that way. He's taking an experienced element and a sort of rather flamboyant showing off element of his army, combining the two to make them fight as long as possible, because that's what his plan requires, to pull the Romans in and funnel them towards the centre, funnel them into what's effectively a trap. On the other hand, of course, he has interspersed them. We've mentioned this already. He's no longer deploying just the tribe, the clan in one big block and letting them get on with it, which is the traditional way these tribes will have fought. So there's also an element of integration in this, and showing that perhaps there's less difference between the two than you might think, that they trust each other to have the different ethnic group on their flanks, and that Hannibal is there with them, as is Mago, his brother. They will help to motivate them. They're described, if I remember correctly, I think Polybius describes them as sperai. It's one of those vague words that at this period can be used for maniple, can be used for a smallish unit. Later on it will be used quite often for a cohort of auxilia or others. It's probably the sort of description for a unit measured in hundreds rather than bigger than that, or less than that. But again, when it's sometimes used for a maniple, those might only be 120 at their, the basic strength. Some might be bigger. You would assume just from the sheer numbers that the units of the Iberians are smaller than the ones of Gauls, or otherwise they're not interspersed evenly, because there'll have to be gaps where there simply aren't enough Iberians and Lusitanians, basically people from the Spanish Peninsula, to go around. So, they do function effectively, and they respond to the orders, to the encouragement of Hannibal and Mago. So, yes, you might be inspiring your Gauls to show off their valour, but you're there to witness it. That's an important role for a chieftain, for a king. Later it will be for a Roman general. It already is for a Roman general. So it's complementary. Essentially, you've taken these different fighting styles, but again, these are basically people who fight in relatively close order and are willing to go toe-to-toe with the enemy. They probably throw things at the enemy first, perhaps more effectively if many of the Spanish are using some of the throwing weapons from the Iberian Peninsula that are very similar to the Roman pilum, presumably javelins and other missiles from the Gauls. But like a lot of people who fight, particularly in the Western Mediterranean, you throw things at the enemy first, you weaken them, and then you charge in and hope that he'll run away. But if he doesn't, you've got to fight your way through him. They're fighting in a similar respect in that way, even if they have different shaped swords and a slightly different approach to it. This is even more true with the cavalry of his army. You have this combination of light and heavy. Now, Hannibal has concentrated his Numidians on his right flank, and they will skirmish with torment really the Romans, not allow themselves to be drawn into hand-to-hand combat, will run from a charge but rally just as quickly and keep on nibbling away at you with their javelins, with their missiles. They'll dare to go close because they're confident enough that they're good enough horsemen. They will get away. You will not be able to catch them. Again, they fight in a way that is traditional to them, but it's clever. It's very efficient. And Hannibal is making use of that, whereas on his left flank he's got his close order cavalry, the heavier cavalry in that sense. Probably more of them have protective equipment as well, whereas the Numidians don't use that. But men who are willing to charge, and they will break through the Roman flank and then go all the way around the army to take out the cavalry facing the Numidians, and then rally again, at least some of them, to come and take the Roman infantry in the rear. Now, that is an incredible achievement by any standards for cavalry in any period of history. It's quite hard to get cavalry to rally after one successful charge. To do it twice and still have them in good enough order, or at least enough of them. Now, probably the narrow frontage of the battlefield allows you to form them in several lines of troop squadrons, call them what you will. But again, these are a mixture. Some of them are Gauls, some of them are Spanish, perhaps some Africans and others. They're a mixture of the ones you've brought with you from New Carthage in 218 and the Gauls that have joined since then, and they are all integrated. The control exercised by the officers over them, and these are Carthaginians, is extremely tight, exceptionally so, as I say, by any standards, that they can break the Romans facing them, and then only some of you go off to pursue them, but the bulk of you rally, move around under control behind the entire Roman army, and go and take the Roman cavalry on the Roman left in the rear, and rout them as well, and then rally again, and don't all go herring off after them, but enough of you rally, reform to charge into the rear of the Roman infantry. That's a incredible achievement, and it's one of several where you just see the quality of Hannibal's army. I probably mentioned in the last talks, moving into position where you get your entire army in ambush positions ahead of the Roman army at Lake Trasimene is another example, in doing that at night and then in the fog. And anybody who's been on any sort of nighttime exercise, it's just harder when you can't see. People are inclined to get lost. It requires very good training, very good control, very good leadership to motivate everybody, but also to make sure everybody's in the right place at the right time. And these are things that show you the sheer quality of Hannibal's army. It's the integration of these different fighting styles, but also the skill with which they perform any task he sets them. These are extremely good soldiers under extremely good officers. This is a really well-practiced team. And it's improved. The Gauls by this time have been significantly integrated into the overall. So you've got contingents, some of which are perhaps better than others or suited to particular roles. You've got your Balearic slingers, your skirmishers. Elephants you've had early on. You'll get some more later on, but there are none of them around to make any difference at Cannae. And you are combining all of those. The Numidians are effective, highly effective in battle, but absolutely superb for raiding. Because again, this draws on the traditions of their own form of warfare, but you are doing it in a more directed form. You're taking, in a sense, the best ways of fighting of the Numidians, and you are giving it a much clearer and more focused sense of purpose. They don't just raid for their own benefit, for their own plunder. They're doing it because Hannibal wants them to, and it contributes to his war effort. And that's, again, a mark of the quality of this army and the combination of all these different troop types, different fighting styles. The Gauls, as I say, mentioned before, get chosen for their speed at Tarentum. However, the army hasn't been assembled with Hannibal thinking, well, I want some heavy cavalry, I want some light cavalry, I want some elephant, I want this. Every Carthaginian commander has to work with what's available. So to a great extent, it depends on the allies he can get. So once he's in Italy, he gets some small reinforcement, including some elephants from Carthage. But on the whole, this is a small contribution to the war effort. He gets the allies that he can find in Italy. So he gets Gauls, he gets Ligurians, he gets Samnites, other Oscan speakers, various southern Italians who fight in the way that they know how to fight. He gets some Roman deserters later on as well. You make use of what you've got and you plug them into the system, and you try and work out what they're good at and exploit that. But in most cases, you're getting more cavalry, more infantry, simply people that you can use in a battle line much the same way as your own, and fight in a very similar style. So again, there might be this trend, probably with the exception of some of the Balearic slingers, Numidians, people like that, who are very specialized. A lot of your troops are probably getting more and more alike as the years go on, simply because it's easiest to re-equip them that way and it's easier to use them that way. So Hannibal's army is extremely well balanced. That partly reflects the initial force that he's brought, and he's taken care to treat with as much delicacy as he can on that long march to Italy. So the fact that he gets these 6,000 cavalry, 20,000 infantry, all of them very good troops, those are the ones that arrive in northern Italy, and then adds other contingents on them. That's already a high proportion of cavalry for an army of that size by ancient standards, particularly by the standards of the Western Mediterranean. By the time you've got to Cannae, Hannibal has a higher proportion of cavalry than Alexander at Issus or Gaugamela. He's got 10,000 cavalry to 40,000 infantry. So 20% of his army is mounted, and they're all good. And that means even though the Roman army overwhelmingly outnumbers him in sheer numbers, they don't in terms of cavalry. So Hannibal has taken some care to get a balanced army, and as he adds other contingents, he tries to keep that to a great degree successfully, at least while he's in Italy. The problem is the Romans keep learning and the Romans don't give in, but that takes us on to the strategy, which we've talked about elsewhere. Elsewhere, Carthaginian armies are much less balanced in terms of their different components, and that's very clear in Spain. The armies that the Romans face in Spain and subsequently in North Africa don't have the same high proportion of good quality cavalry that Hannibal commands. That's apart from the other differences in which we'll come back to when we look at command structure. And the probability is they seem to have particularly fewer heavy cavalry. They've got some Numidians, they've got some cavalry that can skirmish. Now this may well be a reflection of warfare in Spain before the Carthaginians arrive. The traditions there, that they simply don't require large numbers like that, or people of the social level and the wealth to fight that, to afford horses and heavy equipment, don't choose to fight mounted. They fight for whatever reasons with other contingents. It may also be encouraged by the Carthaginians. You have to wonder how many of the cavalry that Hannibal leads from New Carthage that get to Italy are mounted not necessarily on the horses they've brought with them when they've been recruited, but the horses they've been supplied by the Carthaginians. That's obviously going to be true as the campaign goes on, because your original horses, they are going to suffer, they are going to die, and they'll need to be replaced. But it might also be there's a different style of warfare, that war is about different things, and that the role of the horse is something where you need it to transport you to battle like an Anglo-Saxon huskar or a Viking warrior, but you don't necessarily plan to fight from it. But it's giving you mobility in a strategic sense rather than a tactical sense. But elsewhere, Hannibal's army is unique because of its balance of different troop types, the mix of different troop types, and the degree to which they integrate and work together as a team is not matched by any other Carthaginian army that we see. So that's a big difference, and we'll try and explain why that's true in a moment. But you also have a tendency for a higher proportion of recently recruited allies in the armies in Spain. One of the reasons why things can go so badly wrong both for the Romans and Carthaginians in Spain is because of defections by allied contingents that aren't too committed to your cause, aren't under your control. They're not like the various troops within Hannibal's army that within a few years are very much people he can order to do things and they will do it. He doesn't have to go to a chieftain, to a king, and say, right, I'd quite like you to do this for me, and then cajole him, persuade him into doing it. That's very often the case elsewhere, with the various peoples of the Iberian Peninsula join up with Carthaginian armies, because to face the Romans they need numbers, as do the Romans. The Scipio brothers lose because most of their allies defect and change sides, decide, well, we're not committed to your cause, we're going to leave. And the numbers go and they're overwhelmed. Same thing will happen to some Carthaginian commanders later on. The same is true in North Africa. It's obviously the big defection of the Numidians in particular that allows Scipio Africanus to win at Zama. And he's worked on that, and he's deliberately done this. So again, we'll come back to this in a moment. Let's look now at the command structure, because this is the critical thing, and this is one of the major weaknesses of the system in general, but not of Hannibal's army, because the only unity is provided by the Carthaginians. And that's, as we mentioned before, it's the big problem for the rebels in the Mercenary War, the Sacred War, because they don't have existing commanders that everybody will obey and who know what they're doing. Carthaginian armies can be effective, but they need time. They need time to integrate all these different components, get them used to fighting alongside each other, get them to trust the Carthaginian leaders appointed over them, do what they want, and train. One of the things, Hannibal's army has a lot of experience. You could contrast Hannibal's army in 218 to 202. It's become highly integrated. As I say, they are simply Hannibal's Italian veterans when he gets them to North Africa. It's very hard to tell the different ethnic contingents apart, or at least our sources don't depict them that way, as they have to some extent before, but as the war goes on that becomes less and less obvious. It's more about Hannibal's men fighting them. But of course they're much weaker by then, because a lot of the best men have perished by that time, and it's not as big an army, it's not as balanced an army. We'll come back to that in a moment. But it's before 218, it's already the hardcore of that army are highly experienced as a team. They fought under Hannibal's father, they fought under his brother-in-law, they fought under Hannibal for years, expanding, consolidating Carthaginian territory in the Iberian Peninsula. They've won a lot of victories, they've got used to operating together, and this extends to the less visible aspects of campaigning. You have the specialists who know how to supply the army, to organise it, to pass on the orders, to get things done. This is a very ordered force, and while we have few details, you suspect this extends to how it camps, how it marches, how it reconnoitres, all of these things. They know who's in charge. You have a team of officers that are very good at working together. Cannae could not possibly have worked for Hannibal if not only he had this well-balanced army that trusted him, that followed him, but if he didn't have the leaders from himself, his brother downwards, at every level, subordinates he could trust to deal with things and to do the right thing. And you could say that about anybody successful. Alexander the Great fights as heroically he does because he knows that somebody else is dealing with all the problems that are going on, that anything that might arise elsewhere. He can trust Parmenio or whoever it might be to the regimental commanders of the different phalanx contingents. Trust them to make decisions when he isn't there to see what's going on and doesn't have time to react. Hannibal at Cannae trusts people to do particularly complicated tasks, most notably, as I say, dealing with the heavy cavalry and rallying them twice and leading them back to where they were wanted. This is the mark of a very experienced team that know how to do things, know how to get things done and can trust each other. The danger, of course, is that as the war goes on, he loses a lot of these people, just as he loses the edge of many of his ordinary units. He loses a lot of commanders. You have, for instance, the casualties after Cannae. Now, whilst the Roman casualties are catastrophic, Hannibal loses anything from 5 to close to 10% of his own men. These are very high losses for a victorious army in the ancient world, because all those Romans and Italians take a lot of killing. But it's noted in the sources that he lost many of his leaders and his best men. And that, of course, is the danger in all types of warfare. The people who go first and who say, follow me, are running higher risks. They are conspicuous. They are the ones the enemy want to take out, but they're taking chance after chance. And over time, they suffer a very high loss rate, and you cannot always replace them. And particularly, it's very hard to get back to that army you had at the start. It's still a highly experienced force at the end, but it's smaller, and it's less well balanced, and it doesn't quite have the sophistication. So it is a very good army, and Hannibal's army, that contingent, remains very effective. But the problem is other Carthaginian armies just aren't like that. Elsewhere, Hannibal will run rings around the Romans, but elsewhere Carthaginian armies tend to lose, and they don't perform anything like as well in the operations in Spain. They don't in the Metaurus campaign, when Hannibal's brother brings his army, trying to join up with Hannibal, doesn't get to him, is surrounded and overwhelmed by the Romans before he can get anywhere near, and they just take him to bits. And his army is not as effective. The one his other brother, Mago, tries to raise in northern Italy doesn't really achieve very much. It takes time to create these Carthaginian armies, and the one Hannibal leads to Italy is an exceptional force that he continues to preserve the quality, even expand on its size and its balance of different troop types and its skill as acting as a team, because bear in mind he gives them victory after victory, and that's a pretty intoxicating thing for any soldier in any time. The expectation you're going to win and you're probably going to come out of this alive with prestige, with lots of booty, and it's the other side that are going to die. It's a great motivating factor. But other Carthaginian commanders can't do that. They fight battles that are draws or are defeats, and they don't have time to do it. It's exactly the same in the First Punic War. In the land battles, the Carthaginians don't do well. They win one major battle when they defeat Regulus, but that's it. Apart from when they're fighting Hannibal, the Romans win the vast majority of land battles in both the First and Second Punic Wars. Hannibal makes it work because he's created what's really the best Punic army ever to take the field. And it's strong enough for him to graft on these new contingents without losing that quality. In fact, if anything, it enhances it. But he doesn't have time to do that. When he's recalled from Italy in 203 to 202, it's notable that he effectively has three separate armies. He's got stuff brought from northern Italy that Mago, his brother, had raised before Mago dies. He's got his own Italian veterans, and he's got troops that are survivors of the earlier defeats in North Africa and have been raised since then locally. But these are three distinct contingents, and he forms them in three lines, and in the sources doesn't even speak to anyone other than his own veterans. He gets their own commanders to talk to the first line and the second line. Now, some of it's copying Roman tactics. See, the Romans fight in three lines. Hannibal's doing this. But it's also, he's got this one really well-practiced team, but there's not too many of them left by now. They don't have the numbers to take on the Romans. And he doesn't have time to integrate the other contingents and the other commanders, whether allied, whether Carthaginian, into the command structure, the staff structure of his familiar team of people. There simply isn't the opportunity to do that. And combine that with the defection of Massinissa, that the Romans have more Numidian cavalry than he has. They have a cavalry advantage. The elephants he has, he's got lots of them, but they're not well trained, and Scipio is able to negate their effect. Hannibal then doesn't do a lot. He's basically relying on wearing the Romans down, and even to the point where it's almost certainly Roman propaganda, but he's sort of callously supposed to have thought of the first and second lines as just there to blunt the swords of the Romans so that his veterans can do the business in the third line. But there aren't enough of them, quite simply. It's not that Hannibal is any less of a commander, it's just his army is not the army it had been before. Only a small part of it is. And the Romans have learnt an awful lot in the years since those early victories, and they're good and they're well practiced and they've got a well balanced force now, and therefore he is systematically taken apart. When the elephant attack doesn't really work, there's nothing very clever that he attempts. There's no bit of Hannibal cunning. It's essentially a slogging match, and the Romans do more maneuvers where they reinforce their fighting line, but they also expand it and outflank. They do the clever things in this battle, and of course they've got the greater number of cavalry, particularly Numidian cavalry, and they're able to win on the flanks, so it's all over. So it tells us a lot about the strengths and the weaknesses of the Carthaginian system, because one of the strengths, one of the advantages as far as they're concerned, is they're not forced to maintain a permanent army. They're not required to send a lot of their citizens off to war and risk large numbers of deaths, which can have a severe effect on a citizen population. And that's one of the dangers in war between the Greek states, where particularly the Spartans, they will negotiate a peace treaty to get back the 100 or so prisoners from Sphacteria in the Peloponnesian War, because you just don't want to lose too many citizens. The Spartans have a particular manpower problem, but it's there for a lot of Greek states. Your citizens have value. Serious losses, serious defeats have a major effect on your entire community. The Carthaginians avoid that by getting other people to do their fighting for them. And because they don't maintain a permanent army, they don't have anybody who's can control that army, and therefore is a threat to the state in that respect as a dictator. Although, of course, the Barcid family, from Hannibal's father onwards, they will really base their power, their status as the leaders of this army that forms in Spain. There are problems. It's very hard to tell just what the relationship between Hamilcar and then his son-in-law and then Hannibal, what they actually were with the Carthaginian government, the Carthaginian state. how much they were sort of independent princes, almost warlords, going on doing their own thing and expecting the state to support them, how much they were receiving instructions and orders and under the control of the authorities at Carthage. What they did instead of having a permanent army was hire people, many of them already well trained in these certain forms of fighting, sometimes bringing their own weapons, at least to some degree. They're already warriors, or they're peasants like the Libyans that seem to respond to training very well and become very good, tough soldiers. Relatively quick to train infantry to fight, much harder to train cavalrymen from scratch to fight. So again, one of those reasons it's easier to take Numidians and others who are superb horse warriors anyway before they get to you, and the same true with the nobles amongst Gallic tribes and elsewhere, but you do train some. You avoid the threat of a military revolution overthrowing your state, of the army commander throwing it out, and you get a diversity of troop types, which can be good in combination. You're able to absorb casualties in the sense that they're suffered by foreigners, not by you, so the state doesn't collapse. The drawback of that is, of course, it takes time. It takes time to go and recruit new contingents from allies, hire mercenaries, then bring them together. It takes even more time to integrate them into a fighting force under your command and control. That's the hard part. That's the bit that takes a really long time. It's something that the Barcid family has done over many years in Spain before the Second Punic War begins. It's something that nobody else really has the opportunity to do to anything like that extent. You can bulk out your forces with allies, but allies are dangerous because they might defect. They might just desert, as they do in Spain, as they do in North Africa. After the capture of New Carthage in 210 BC, Scipio Africanus captures hostages from the noble families of many of Carthage's allies that are there for the sort of surety, basically. Now, that's not infallible, but it does help to keep the loyalty of the princes, the kings, the leaders of communities, if they feel that some of their sons, their daughters are held there as in comfortable captivity, but nevertheless captivity, and could be executed by the Carthaginians should they choose. The Romans gaining control of that is a major advantage for them, and Scipio plays it very well, sending most people back, releasing them, encouraging them to switch sides. But again, it shows how this is a dangerous way. Relying a lot on allies is risky. It can work, but it can also risk a sudden collapse. And the balance of numbers and troop types could swing the other way, as it does at Zama. Hannibal's done so well because he's had a big advantage in cavalry for a long time over the Romans, particularly in quality, but also in quantity. And quantity is the key thing. The Roman cavalry will improve as the war goes on. Hannibal's are good from the start, and he's got more of them, but again, they will gradually be worn down as his whole army. In many respects, the system is almost suited to a short, decisive war. If you are expecting war, if you've planned it, you can gather your army, you can train your army, you can prepare your army to an exceptional degree if you're Hannibal, and then launch a quick war whilst your army is good, the enemy's might not be, but your army is close to its peak, and you can overwhelm them. That's exactly what Hannibal's trying to do in 218 BC. I mean, again, go to the strategy papers. It's an unusual thing for the Carthaginians to do, but it has a logic to it. They're either good for that, or they're good for the sort of war you fought in the First Punic War in Sicily, which is a very long, low-intensity attritional struggle, where you're not risking big battles because they're too dangerous, but you can keep your army ticking over, and you hope the enemy will eventually give up or negotiate. So those are really the options, but you can only do the Hannibal thing if you've got an army as good as Hannibal and you're lucky enough to have a general as capable as Hannibal. The attritional one is fine against a lot of people, but it doesn't work against the Romans because those so-and-sos don't quit. They keep coming back, and eventually you have to give in rather than them. So the conclusion of this is that Hannibal's army is very much the best ever produced by the system. Everything comes together in terms of its size, the balance of forces, the experience, the command structure. It's already a highly confident force in 218 before it comes up against the Romans. And then the victories only fuel that confidence, that belief in itself. But even so, you've got very heavy wastage on the march to Italy. And you can't match Roman numbers in the long term, because although, yes, there are more people, allies and mercenaries out there you might recruit, getting them to the right place and then convincing them to fight for you and fight well for you is a lot harder than it is for the Romans, who have this vast body of citizens and allies, not only eligible but willing to serve, and serve with enthusiasm under tight discipline in the army against Rome's enemies. So you can't match the Romans in the long terms, and Hannibal can't be everywhere at once. In Italy, once he gets these new allies, they're also vulnerable. Again, we've talked far more in the strategy section about how Hannibal can't rush around and protect all of them, and they are obviously the key things for the Romans to attack, because A, the Romans are really annoyed and they don't want anybody else to defect, so they're angry, they want vengeance, but they're also vulnerable because Hannibal can only be in one place at a time. And there are the Romans can field lots of troops, and that's why in the later stages of the war, to a great extent post-Cannae, they don't form one big army, they form several field armies, and they avoid too many pitched battles with Hannibal. And although they suffer defeats, they never suffer quite the disasters of earlier on, and they always have other armies in the field. And the mobilization of manpower has just increased the extent where you can absorb those losses. But you keep on striking back, you're winning victories elsewhere. You're punishing the allies who defected until they realise Hannibal can't protect them, so they go back to Rome and surrender. The Romans win the victories in Spain. They manage some smaller victories in Macedonia, but that war really peters out. They manage bigger victories in Sicily, and then eventually they're able to send Scipio Africanus off to invade North Africa, and that's what forces Hannibal out of Italy. But he's already been confined into a small area, and his army is a shadow of what it had once been, and his potential to do anything. And there's not much more he can do to the Romans to make them give in. The strategy has failed by that point. Again, I refer you back to the talks on the strategy of the Punic Wars. We want to go into this in detail. Carthage, quite simply, and that's the theme of those talks, was less devoted to the war effort than the Roman Republic was. And because the Romans do this, and because the Romans are so determined, the Romans win. So that's the Carthaginian military system. It's very, very different from the Roman system. It can work, and it's not as simple as saying Hannibal has all these different troop types and therefore it gives him something that always gives him an advantage over the Romans. It gives him an advantage because he's put those troops together and formed them into one very coherent, well-coordinated team under his control and under very good officers. As I said before, everything comes right for Hannibal. This is the pinnacle of this Carthaginian military system, but the fact that it's only Hannibal that does that is only in part a reflection of Hannibal as an exceptional military commander and a highly gifted general and leader, with a particularly shrewd tactical mind. All of those things he can do because of the quality of the army. The quality of the army owes something to him, it owes something to his father, to his family in general, and that preparation, but it is effectively a one-shot weapon. He's got this. If he can't win the war, no one else is going to do it. And he tries and comes achieves remarkable things in those early years, but when the Romans don't quit, there's not much else he can do. The Carthaginians simply cannot make another army like that, and it's hard to tell how able Hannibal's brothers were compared to him, but they don't have the army under their command to do what he did. So they may well have been very gifted, very capable commanders and inspirational leaders, but there is only one army like that, and there isn't, another one is never made. So that's the great weakness of the Carthaginian system, that while it had the potential to make something as exceptionally efficient and skilled and highly motivated and well balanced as Hannibal's army, it can't reproduce that. It never does that. It's never able to, and the system doesn't really allow it. And even that is created in those exceptional circumstances where you're preparing for war for years. That does rather feed into the idea that Hannibal at least is willing to consider war as a likely eventuality if the threat of war doesn't work. But he has prepared himself. He has made himself very strong. He's given Carthage the potential, which might not necessarily have been obvious to the Romans, that Hannibal was as good a commander and had as good an army as he possessed. It probably almost certainly didn't. Nevertheless, that's it. The war effort relies on him. And whilst he no doubt has the boundless confidence of many successful commanders and thinks he can win the war, and, against most other states he probably would have won the war, perhaps any other state in the ancient world he would have won the war, the Romans just don't quit. And their army can reproduce itself and does learn and does get better and better the longer it's in existence. So all the advantages Hannibal has at the start of the war get less and less and less until they finally disappear by the Zama campaign. So that's some thoughts on the Carthaginian military system and Carthaginian armies. Hope you've enjoyed it today. This is a one-off. I'm not quite sure what we'll be doing next. I think 2 weeks' time we'll have the 100th episode and we'll do the Q&A session. We might do another one on the HBO Rome next time. I'm not quite sure. But thanks for watching for the moment. Hope you've enjoyed it and see you next time.